So you want to get married to your partner? Well, not so fast. The number one cause of divorce is not infidelity, it's money. If you and your partner are not on the same page when it comes to money, it's just not going to work out. 1 in 3 marriages in Australia and almost half of marriages in the UK and the US end in divorce. Relationships are great. They provide people with a source of happiness, purpose, and experiencing the joy of love. That's all well and good, but it's also important to remember that sometimes things don't turn out that way. Divorce in Australia can cost up to $150,000, and the average cost of divorce in the UK is almost £15,000. There are so many money issues when it comes to divorce that people don't even realize. So that's why in today's video, I'm going to talk to you about how you can protect yourself financially, as well as having a healthy relationship with your partner, especially when it comes to your finances. So let's get into today's video. You know, relationships are great. It's so euphoric falling in love, and it's wonderful thinking that you've met someone who you can spend the rest of your life with. But the harsh reality is, for a lot of people, things will change later on, with marriages and partnerships breaking down and leaving people financially ruined. Divorce not only has huge legal costs, but there's also a whole bunch of other things that people don't even think about before they get married. There's the cost of therapy, which a lot of people need because, let's be honest, going through a divorce is a really traumatic experience. And if you have kids, there's also the issue of child support payments and who's going to look after them. And then there's also the increased cost of living after you separate from your partner and having to live by yourself. It really goes beyond just giving away half of your savings or your assets to your ex-partner. In Australia, women retire with just over half of the amount of retirement savings compared to men. And 23% of women retire with no retirement savings at all. Retirement savings are also significantly lower for divorced mothers than married mothers, who have on average 68% less. Divorced fathers also have about 60% less money in their retirement savings than married fathers. And overall, divorced parents just have a lot less in their retirement savings than married parents. Home ownership is also a huge challenge. 40% of divorced mothers and 32% of divorced fathers still rent 5 years after their divorce settlement has ended. So people who go through divorce are significantly more likely to be disadvantaged financially, and they may not have the same financial opportunities that they could have had if they had remained married. Having a dual income actually benefits both parties involved. It makes housing more affordable, living costs are less expensive, and also the ability to just live a really good lifestyle and still be able to save money. But this is why so many people still decide just to stay together in a relationship that they probably aren't happy with, purely for financial reasons. You know, a relationship, in my opinion, is all about seeing your significant other as a partnership. And both of you have to be on the same page when it comes to money. This is especially important if you're planning to have kids. There's often this unconscious bias decision that occurs in relationships where one person, who's usually the wife, ends up having to leave their work or their career in order to raise the children, and the husband stays on in their full-time role. This means that the wife is significantly disadvantaged financially during a divorce because they had to quit their job in order to raise their children, and as a result, just have less money in their retirement accounts. It's also challenging trying to even find another job after taking 1 to 3 years out of work to raise kids. It's extremely hard for the wife to claim time off work as a factor when the assets are being divided. This often means that husbands are usually better off after a divorce financially, and the mum is often left in a compromised situation. So how can you protect yourself from this? Well, if you are thinking about getting married, you should definitely consider getting a prenup, or in Australia, a binding financial agreement. Why? Well, most people associate prenups with old, rich white men getting their trophy wives to sign something in order to protect their assets. But prenups, or financial agreements, are ultimately there to protect you if things do go wrong, and also to protect you from financial abuse. Prenups are also going to force out the truth on both sides. It tells you how much your partner is really earning and also how much debt they have. You can't be marrying someone who's got a chronic gambling problem and is just in heaps of debt. And ultimately, you're not going to know these things unless you do get a prenup. I've seen so many instances where people get divorced and just try to take everything from their partner, hiding away assets, getting them to sign over their stocks, having to sell a jointly owned property, and trying to figure out who gets what. And then there's also all the legal costs involved as as well. You don't want everything that you've worked so hard for just get taken away by someone else. Research has shown that nearly 16% of Australian women and 8% of Australian men suffer financial abuse. So having a financial agreement in place ultimately protects you from this. People who are victims of financial abuse often don't know where their money goes, and their partners often hide it away and then gaslight them. So you also need to make sure that you know everything about your finances before you get married to your partner. Because if divorce does occur, it's really important to make sure that you're on the same page about all transactions. And you certainly want to avoid arguments about unknown transactions. I'm certainly not suggesting that you should force your partner to sign a prenup or a binding financial agreement in order to protect your assets. But what I am saying is that you ultimately need to protect yourself financially. And if you are planning to have kids, you should certainly consider having some sort of pre-agreement in place in case one of you does decide to take a significant period of time off work in order to raise the children. Again, this is just my personal opinion, but relationships are only going to work if you see your partner as someone who you can ultimately build your wealth with together. And this can only occur if you have these types of honest conversations up front. And what's the agreement in place if you're both planning to have kids? If one of you is going to take time off work, should the other person, usually the husband, make extra contributions to the wife's retirement savings account? Because although, say, if the wife is taking time off work to raise kids, and they may not be contributing financially to that relationship, they are still contributing to that relationship by ultimately raising the children. I've heard so many people say that they're worried about talking to their partners about having a prenup or binding financial agreement in place. If it's a problem with your partner now, wait and see what happens in 10 years' time. That being said though, obviously having a financial agreement in place means that you're not just marrying someone for money, and it also doesn't mean that you're going into that relationship just thinking about divorce. Most people have deal breakers when it comes to relationships. For example, maybe your deal breaker is that your partner has really bad family issues, or they're just a complete cheapskate. There's no physical attraction, or they just have really bad hygiene. These are all great, but I also want your deal breaker to be that your partner is financially irresponsible. It's totally fine to date someone who wants to live a lavish lifestyle. You don't want to be dating someone who's buying all of those things on credit card debt. Yes, it'll definitely be nice in the beginning, but in the long run, it's just not going to work out. Because at some point, that debt will just continue to pile up and you'll no longer be able to pay back even the interest on the debt that you used to buy all that junk in the first place. And you certainly don't want to get into a situation where you're responsible for that person's financial irresponsibility and having to pay back all that debt. The other thing that you should consider when you're dating someone is to think about whether that person has goals and ambitions to improve themselves both personally and financially. I'm certainly not saying that you should have some sort of financial cutoff when it comes to dating and only date people who are earning a minimum of 6 figures. But if you have been dating someone for a while and realize that they don't have any drive or ambition to improve themselves financially, that in my opinion is a bit of a red flag. Wanting to date people who are ambitious and do have drive doesn't make you a snob. You can't get into a situation where you marry someone like this and ultimately have to serve them financially. And even worse, losing so much of what you've worked so hard for if that relationship doesn't improve and ends in divorce. And again, I'm not saying you should just flat out ask people that you date how much money they're earning, but it is really important to gauge what type of work ethic they have. So maybe you could ask them, what do you do for work? Did you go to university or trade school after high school? Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? What ultimately fulfills you and drives you? All of these things. And this ultimately comes back to my previous point about the prenup. If you get married to someone without a prenup, you ultimately don't know how much debt they could be in. So having a prenup in place is ultimately going to protect you from getting into these sorts of situations. The other thing that you should consider doing before you get married is a 90-day challenge. And this is where you take both of your combined incomes over the last 3 months and then list all of your expenses. You have to lay everything out on the table here. It's really important to be honest with yourself and also your partner about how much you're earning and how much your expenses are. Then subtract your total expenses from your total earnings. If that balance is negative, you need to stop right there and fix that before you both get married. And if that balance is positive, then both of you need to be on the same page about where that money goes. Do you want to spend it? Do you want to save it? Do you want to invest it together? Relationships are not going to work out if you don't see your money as a partnership. If you're living with your partner like a sort of housemate, There's just no unison there. Couples that are ultimately successful in the long run see their partner as someone that they can build wealth with in unison, and ultimately seeing it as a team effort. Do you also want kids? They're $600,000 a pop by the time they get to 18. And if you want to send them to a private school, that's an extra $500,000 by the time they get to 18 as well. So just think about that for a second. It's going to cost you at least $1.2 million if you want to have 2 kids, or about 65 grand a year for 18 years. How are you and your partner going to be able to afford that on top of everything else? If you want to buy a house, that's a mortgage, so that's even more debt. There's also everything else involved, like transport fees, utilities, bills, groceries, insurance, all of these things. So what's the plan in place for you to be able to afford all of this? Including the student debt that you probably still have because you went to university and did a useless undergraduate degree and then had to go back and do a relevant postgraduate degree in order to get a job. All of these things have to be written down and put into a plan so that you can ultimately pay them back properly with your partner and have a marriage that lasts. If you've made it this far in the video, you're probably thinking at this point that this is not nice advice and that these sorts of issues are not going to build great relationships. Yes, I agree, it's not romantic, but it ultimately does matter. Because in every relationship, there's always going to be that initial really nice honeymoon period for the first 2 or 3 years. And then at that point, you have to seriously consider whether you want to be with that person for the rest of your life. And with that comes an assessment of your shared values and responsibilities. Is your partner financially responsible? Can you both communicate effectively with money? Are you on the same page in terms of what lifestyle you both want? Because if you're not, it's just not going to work out. Having these sorts of hard conversations up front with your partner is not going to be nice. But if you don't, these issues are only just going to get worse and worse. It ultimately just comes down to considering the worst case scenario so that you can avoid it. But I do want to stress that there's obviously so many other things when it comes to building healthy relationships that go well and truly beyond just money. It's just making sure that you have these honest conversations up front in order to make sure that you're both on the same page and have a long and successful marriage together.